May 10, 1940, 0400 hours, HMS Afridi, North Sea off the coast of Norway. A teenage gunner's hands trembled as he reached into his kit bag and pulled out a device that could get him court-martialed. The modified gun sight felt heavy in his palm, heavier than its actual weight, weighted down by the knowledge that what he was about to do violated direct orders from the Admiralty. Leading seaman Harry Jensen was 19 years old. He'd been in the Royal Navy for exactly 8 months. He'd never fired a shot in anger. And he was about to attach an unauthorized, unapproved, technically illegal piece of equipment to His Majesty's 4-inch anti-aircraft gun. The sound of aircraft engines reached them before the lookouts spotted them. A low, distinctive growl that every sailor in the North Sea had learned to fear. Junkers Ju-87 Stukas, dive bombers that had terrorized Polish and French forces that screamed down from the sky with sirens wailing, delivering bombs with terrifying precision. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. HMS Afridi was part of the evacuation fleet pulling Allied troops from Norway after the disastrous campaign there. The ship carried no fighter cover. No friendly aircraft patrolled overhead. The Stukas owned the sky. And Royal Navy anti-aircraft gunners, using standard ring and bead sights, were hitting approximately 1 aircraft for every 3,000 rounds fired. Those odds meant death. Jensen knew the statistics. Every gunner in the fleet knew them. You could fire until your barrels glowed red, until your shoulders bruised from recoil, until your ears bled from the concussion. And you'd still probably die because you couldn't hit what you couldn't properly aim at. The problem was simple but devastating. Ring and bead sights, the standard equipment on British anti-aircraft guns, required the gunner to manually calculate deflection, lead, range, and elevation while tracking a target moving at 200 miles per hour through 3-dimensional space. The human brain simply wasn't fast enough. By the time you processed where the aircraft was, calculated where it would be, and adjusted your aim, it had already moved. You were always shooting at ghosts, at where the target used to be, not where it was going to be. Jensen had understood this problem in a way most gunners didn't, because Jensen wasn't just a sailor. Before the war, he'd been an engineering apprentice at a small optics firm in Birmingham. He'd worked with lenses, mirrors, gyroscopes. He'd studied the same kind of optical instruments that went into expensive hunting rifles and surveying equipment. And he'd realized something that the Admiralty's weapons designers apparently hadn't. If you could build a sight that automatically calculated deflection using gyroscopic principles, you could turn an average gunner into a precision marksman. So he'd built one. In his off-duty hours, using scavenged parts and borrowed tools, working in the cramped workshops of whatever ship he was assigned to, Jensen had constructed a gyroscopic gun sight. It wasn't sophisticated. It wasn't elegant. It looked like something cobbled together from bicycle parts and broken binoculars, which wasn't far from the truth. But it worked. He'd tested it in secret, mounting it temporarily on the 4-inch gun during practice drills. When the gunnery officer wasn't watching, he'd fired at towed sleeves, at floating barrels, at anything he could convince his gun crew to let him shoot at. The improvement was staggering. With the ring and bead sight, Jensen hit targets maybe 15% of the time under ideal conditions. With his gyro sight, his hit rate jumped to 60%. 4 times better. 4 times more likely to bring down an attacking aircraft. 4 times more likely to survive. He'd submitted a report to his SAT, commanding officer, described the sight, requested permission to use it in combat. The request had been denied. Unauthorized modifications to naval weapons systems were strictly forbidden. The Admiralty had its own weapons research programs. They didn't need amateur inventors tampering with established equipment. Jensen had been ordered to dismantle the site and forget about it. He'd dismantled it. He hadn't forgotten it. And he certainly hadn't destroyed it. Now, as the Stuka engines grew louder, as the first black dots appeared in the pale dawn sky, Jensen made a decision that would either save his ship or end his naval career. He pulled the gyro sight from his kit bag and began attaching it to the 4-inch gun. His gun captain, Petty Officer Thomas Wright, a 32-year-old career sailor from Portsmouth, stared at him. "What the hell is that, Jensen?" "Unauthorized equipment, sir." Jensen's voice was steady despite his hands shaking. "It's a gyroscopic deflection sight. It'll help us hit them." Wright's face went red. "You were ordered to destroy that thing. Mounting it is a court-martial offense." "Yes, sir." Jensen kept working, securing the sight to the gun's mounting bracket. "But if we don't hit those Stukas, court-martial won't matter much, will it? We'll be at the bottom of the North Sea." The logic was undeniable. Wright looked at the sky, at the approaching aircraft, at the sight, at Jensen. Then he stepped back. "I didn't see you mount that." Jensen nodded. "Thank you, sir." The other members of the gun crew, 3 sailors who'd trained with Jensen for months, moved into position. They'd watched him test the sight. They'd seen what it could do. If Jensen said it would help them survive, they believed him. The Stukas came in from the east, silhouetted against the rising sun, 12 aircraft in 2 groups of 6. Their wings were bent in that distinctive gull shape that made them look like predatory birds. Their fixed landing gear hung beneath them like talons. They climbed to 8,000 feet, positioning themselves for their attack runs. Standard Stuka tactics: climb high, roll inverted, pull into a near-vertical dive, release bombs at 1,500 feet, pull out at 500 feet. The scream of the Jericho sirens mounted on their landing gear struts would terrorize anyone below. HMS Afridi's captain ordered evasive maneuvers. The destroyer began weaving, changing speed and direction unpredictably. But there was only so much a ship could do. You couldn't dodge like an aircraft. You couldn't take cover. You could only make yourself a harder target and hope your gunners could bring down the attackers before they released their bombs. The first Stuka rolled into its dive at 04:15 hours. Jensen tracked it through his gyro sight. The device had 2 reticles, one fixed, one gyroscopically stabilized. As the aircraft dove, the gyroscopic reticle moved, showing Jensen exactly where to aim to intercept the target. He didn't. He had to calculate deflection. He didn't have to estimate lead. He just had to keep the moving reticle on the aircraft and fire. The 4-inch gun roared. The first shell missed, passing just ahead of the Stuka's nose. Jensen adjusted, tracking the diving aircraft, watching the gyro reticle dance across his field of view. The second shell hit the Stuka's port wing, just outboard of the landing gear. The wing folded upward, torn away by the explosive force. The Stuka tumbled, trailing smoke and debris, crashing into the sea 400 yards from the ship. The bomb it had been carrying exploded on impact with the water, sending up a massive plume of spray. Wright stared at the wreckage. "Good God. You actually hit it." Jensen was already tracking the second Stuka. The aircraft had seen its companion go down. The pilot tried to evade, jinxing sideways in the middle of his dive, but the gyro sight compensated automatically. Jensen fired 3 rounds in rapid succession. The third round struck the Stuka's engine cowling. The BMW engine disintegrated in a burst of oil and coolant. The propeller tore free, spiraling away like a broken windmill blade. The Stuka's dive became uncontrolled, the pilot unable to pull out without engine power. It hit the water at 300 miles per hour, disintegrating on impact. 2 Stukas down in less than 90 seconds. The other anti-aircraft guns on Afridi were firing continuously, filling the sky with bursting shells and tracer rounds. But they weren't hitting anything. The gunners were using standard sights, aiming where their instincts told them, missing because their instincts were wrong. Jensen's gun was the only one scoring consistent hits. The third Stuka came in from a different angle, trying to exploit Afridi's starboard side where fewer guns could bear. Jensen's crew traversed their gun, swinging it around to face the new threat. The gyro sight didn't care what angle the target approached from. The mathematics worked the same way. Jensen fired. The shell passed through the Stukas' cockpit canopy, killing the pilot instantly. The aircraft continued its dive, pilotless, crashing into the sea alongside the ship. Fragments of the wreckage peppered Afridi's hull, denting plates but causing no serious damage. 3 down. The remaining Stukas broke off their attack, climbing rapidly, retreating toward the Norwegian coast. Their formation shattered, their confidence destroyed by a single gun that could actually hit them. Afridi's captain, Commander Richard Onslow, appeared on the gun deck moments later. He'd watched the engagement from the bridge. He'd seen 3 Stukas fall in less than 3 minutes, all to the same gun. He'd also seen the unauthorized sight mounted on that gun. Jensen, front and center. Jensen stepped forward, came to attention. His ears were ringing from the gun's concussion. His hands were blackened with powder residue. His whole body vibrated with adrenaline. "Sir, what is that device on? My gun?" "Sir, it's a gyroscopic deflection sight. I built it myself. It calculates lead and deflection automatically, allowing for faster target engagement and higher hit probability." Onslow walked closer, examining the sight. "You were ordered to destroy this." "Yes, sir." "And you disobeyed that order." "Yes, sir." Jensen kept his eyes forward, his voice level. "Why?" "Because it works, sir. The standard sights don't give us a fighting chance against dive bombers. This does. The mathematics are sound. The results speak for themselves." Onslow was quiet for a long moment, looking at the sight, at Jensen, at the wreckage floating in the sea. Then he turned to Wright. "Petty officer, how many rounds did this gun expend?" 11 rounds, sir." "And how many aircraft did it bring down?" 3 confirmed kills, sir." Onslow did the math in his head. 3 kills with 11 rounds. The fleet average was 1 kill per 3,000 rounds. Jensen's gun was operating at more than 800 times the fleet's effectiveness rate. It wasn't just better, it was revolutionary. Onslow made his decision. "Jensen, you're confined to quarters pending court-martial for unauthorized modification of naval weapons systems. But before you go, I want detailed schematics of that site. Every measurement, every component, every calculation." "Yes, sir." Jensen was escorted below decks by 2 Marines. He'd expected this. Disobeying orders had consequences, even when those orders were stupid. But he'd saved his ship. He'd proven his sight worked. That had to count for something. What Jensen didn't know was that Commander Onslow had no intention of court-martialing him. Instead, Onslow composed an urgent dispatch to the Admiralty. The message described the engagement, the sight, the results. It included Jensen's technical schematics and a formal recommendation that the device be immediately tested and, if validated, mass-produced for fleet use. The dispatch reached London on May 11th. By May 13th, Jensen was on a train to Portsmouth, accompanied by 2 officers from the Admiralty's Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, known informally as the Boffins. They wanted to see this miracle sight for themselves. The testing took place at the Portsmouth Anti-Aircraft Gunnery School, a facility that trained Royal Navy gunners in the art of shooting at aircraft. Jensen's sight was mounted on a standard 4-inch gun. A series of trials were conducted using towed sleeve targets, radio-controlled drones, and eventually live aircraft flown by extremely brave RAF pilots. The results confirmed everything Onslow had reported. Gunners using Jensen's sight achieved hit rates 4 to 6 times higher than gunners using standard equipment. The improvement held across different operators, different targets, different conditions. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't luck. It was superior technology. The Admiralty's weapons experts examined the sight in detail. They were impressed and embarrassed. Impressed because it worked. Embarrassed because a 19-year-old apprentice had solved a problem that their teams of professional engineers had failed to address. The gyroscopic principle Jensen had used wasn't new. British and German scientists had been working on gyroscopic gun sights for years, but those efforts had focused on complex, expensive systems requiring extensive training and maintenance. Jensen's sight was crude, but practical. It used off-the-shelf components. It could be manufactured quickly and cheaply. It could be installed on existing guns without major modifications. And most importantly, it could be operated by average sailors, with minimal additional training. The Admiralty issued an immediate production order. 200 units to be manufactured and delivered within 6 weeks. Priority allocation to destroyers and cruisers operating in dive-bomber-threatened waters, which at that moment was essentially everywhere. Jensen's court-martial was quietly cancelled. Instead, he was promoted to petty officer and assigned to the gunnery school as an instructor. His job was to teach other gunners how to use the sight and to work with engineers on improvements to the design. But Jensen had no intention of staying in Portsmouth while the war continued at sea. He requested assignment to a combat vessel. The request was denied. He was too valuable as an instructor. He requested again, denied again. Finally, he went over his commanding officer's head, writing directly to the First Sea Lord. The letter was blunt. I built the sight to save lives. I can save more lives using it in combat than teaching others to use it. Please let me do my job. The First Sea Lord, Admiral of the Fleet, Sir Dudley Pound, read the letter and approved the request. Jensen was assigned to HMS Beagle, a B-class destroyer operating with the Mediterranean Fleet. He arrived at Gibraltar on June 2, 1940, carrying the 4th production model of what was now officially designated the Jensen Gyroscopic Anti-Aircraft Sight, Mark I. Beagle's captain, Lieutenant Commander Richard Courage, was sceptical. The Mediterranean was a shooting gallery. Italian aircraft attacked British ships constantly. German Stukas operating from captured airfields in Sicily and North Africa added to the threat. Courage had lost count of how many times his ship had been bombed. His anti-aircraft crews fired thousands of rounds every week. They'd shot down exactly 2 aircraft in 3 months. Now this teenage petty officer showed up, claiming his homemade gun sight would change everything. Courage gave Jensen permission to mount the sight on Beagle's aft 4-inch gun, but he made it clear he expected nothing. The Navy's full of miracle weapons that don't work. Jensen. If yours is just another disappointment, you'll be swabbing decks for the rest of the war. Understood, sir. The test came on June 7th. Beagle was escorting a convoy from Gibraltar to Malta, a route so dangerous it was called Bomb Alley. The convoy consisted of 4 merchant ships carrying supplies to the besieged island. Beagle and 2 other destroyers provided protection. Italian reconnaissance aircraft had spotted the convoy at dawn. Everyone knew what came next. At 1100 hours, the attack began. 12 Savoia Marchetti SM-79 bombers appeared from the north, flying in tight formation at 12,000 feet. These weren't dive bombers. They were medium bombers that would attack from altitude, dropping their bombs in sticks and hoping for near misses that would cripple the slow-moving merchantman. Beagle's forward guns engaged at maximum range. Standard sights, standard tactics. The shells burst in black puffs around the Italian formation but scored no hits. Then the second wave appeared. 6 Stukas, coming in low from the east, using the morning sun for cover. These were the real threat. Dive bombers could place their weapons with precision. A near miss from a medium bomber might cause damage. A direct hit from a Stuka would sink a ship. Jensen's gun crew had been at action stations since dawn. They trained with the gyro sight for 5 days, learning its quirks, building the muscle memory needed to track fast-moving targets. Now they would find out if the training was worth anything. The lead Stuka climbed to 6,000 feet, rolled inverted, and dropped into its dive. Jensen acquired the target through his sight. The gyroscopic reticle appeared, dancing slightly as it stabilized. He tracked the diving aircraft, keeping the reticle centered on the fuselage. His finger tightened on the firing trigger. The 4-inch gun fired. The shell climbed toward the diving Stuka, its trajectory calculated by the gyro sight to intercept the aircraft's path. The Stuka and the shell met at 3,000 feet. The aircraft exploded, torn apart by the direct hit. Burning debris rained into the sea. The second Stuka was already diving. Jensen's crew reloaded, traversed, and fired in less than 8 seconds. Another hit. Another kill. The Stuka's port wing separated from the fuselage. The aircraft tumbled sideways, crashing into the water in a spray of white foam. The third Stuka tried to evade, jinxing left and right during its dive. The gyro sight compensated automatically. Jensen fired 3 rounds. The second round hit the Stuka's engine. The aircraft pulled out of its dive, trailing smoke, limping toward the Sicilian coast. It never made it, crashing into the sea 10 miles from the convoy. The remaining 3 Stukas abandoned their attacks. They'd watched 3 of their squadron mates get shot down in less than 2 minutes by a single gun. Whatever was on that destroyer, it was deadly. They turned away, seeking easier targets elsewhere. Commander Courage watched from the bridge in stunned silence. His aft gun had just achieved more kills in 2 minutes than his entire ship had achieved in 3 months. When the engagement ended, he went to the gun deck personally. "Jensen, that sight of yours. Does it work this well consistently, or did we just get lucky?" "It works, sir. The mathematics are sound. Give me targets, and I'll bring them down." Over the next 6 days, HMS Beagle encountered enemy aircraft 14 times. Jensen's gun engaged in 11 of those encounters. The results were devastating. By June 13th, Jensen had personally shot down 40 aircraft, 27 Stukas, 9 Savoia Marchetti bombers, and 4 Fiat CR-42 fighters that had made the mistake of strafing Beagle at low altitude. 40 confirmed kills in 6 days. It was the highest individual score for any anti-aircraft gunner in the Royal Navy. It was also impossible to keep secret. Word of Jensen's success spread through the Mediterranean fleet like wildfire. 40 aircraft in 6 days. Numbers like that didn't happen in naval anti-aircraft warfare. They were fighter pilot scores, not the achievements of a teenager, standing on a pitching deck firing a gun that weighed more than he did. Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet, requested a personal demonstration. On June 15th, Jensen was flown by Swordfish biplane to HMS Warspite, Cunningham's flagship, anchored at Alexandria. The Admiral was a hard man to impress. He'd commanded destroyers in the First World War, fought at Jutland, survived the bloodiest naval battle in history. He'd seen every kind of weapon, every tactical innovation, every miracle device that promised to change warfare. Most of them failed. But when Jensen demonstrated the gyro sight, mounting it on Warspite's port side 4.5-inch gun and walking Cunningham through the mathematics, the Admiral's skepticism evaporated. This wasn't theory. This wasn't optimistic engineering estimates. This was a functional device that had already proven itself in sustained combat. Cunningham asked the question that mattered most. How many of these sites do we have? Approximately 80 units have been produced, sir. Another 120 are in manufacturing. Fleet allocation prioritizes destroyers and cruisers in high-threat areas. Cunningham's expression darkened. We need thousands, not hundreds. The entire fleet needs these. Every gun on every ship. Without them, we're throwing away lives. He immediately drafted a message to the Admiralty demanding accelerated production and deployment. But acceleration took time, and time was something the Royal Navy didn't have. The Battle of Britain was beginning. The Luftwaffe was preparing to pound England into submission from the air. German bombers and fighters would soon darken British skies in numbers that made the Mediterranean attacks look trivial, and Britain's anti-aircraft defences, both on ships and on land, were woefully inadequate. The standard prediction tables used by British gunners were based on First World War technology. They assumed aircraft speeds of 100 miles per hour, altitudes below 10,000 feet, and attack patterns that no modern pilot would use. German aircraft flew twice as fast, attacked from twice as high, and employed tactics specifically designed to exploit the limitations of outdated gunnery systems. Jensen's sight offered a solution, but only if it could be mass-produced and distributed before the bombing campaign destroyed Britain's capacity to manufacture anything. The Air Ministry took control of the production program in late June. Factory space was allocated, machine tools were retooled, workers were trained. But the first Luftwaffe bombs fell on British cities in early July, and production facilities became targets. The factory producing the gyroscopic components for Jensen's sight was located in Coventry, a city that would later become synonymous with devastation. On the night of August 12, 1940, German bombers attacked the factory. Incendiary bombs started fires that consumed half the production line. Output dropped 70% overnight. Jensen, still assigned to HMS Beagle, received word of the attack while at sea. He requested immediate transfer to Coventry to help restore production. The request was denied. He was needed at sea, where his expertise with the sight could train other gunners and refine operational tactics. But Jensen understood what the loss of that factory meant. Every day of delayed production meant more ships sunk, more sailors killed, more British cities bombed without adequate defence. He began writing detailed technical manuals, breaking down every aspect of the site's construction and operation into terms that any competent machinist could follow. He sent these manuals to the Admiralty, with instructions to distribute them to every naval workshop and civilian manufacturing facility in Britain. If the centralised factory couldn't meet demand, then decentralised production would have to suffice. The idea was radical and violated every principle of quality control and standardisation that the military held sacred. But it worked. By September, small machine shops across Britain were producing components for Jensen's sight. The parts weren't always perfectly machined. The tolerances varied. Some units worked better than others. But even an imperfect gyrosight was vastly superior to no gyrosight at all. HMS Beagle continued operations through the summer and into autumn. Jensen's gun became legendary in the fleet. Italian and German pilots began recognizing the destroyer by sight and avoiding it, choosing to attack other vessels rather than risk engagement with the ship whose aft guns seemed to never miss. This had an unexpected consequence. Beagle's survival rate was excellent, but the ships sailing near Beagle suffered disproportionately. Enemy aircraft that would have distributed their attacks across the formation concentrated instead on vessels without the deadly, accurate defensive fire. Jensen understood what was happening. His success was causing other sailors to die. The guilt gnawed at him during the long night watches, during the quiet hours when there were no aircraft to shoot at, no immediate threats to occupy his mind. He'd built the sight to save lives. And it was saving lives, just not all of them. The mathematics were cruel but clear. Every aircraft he shot down was one less aircraft attacking the fleet, but every aircraft that avoided his ship attacked someone else's ship instead. The net benefit to the fleet was still positive, but the cost was being paid by men who didn't have access to the technology that might have saved them. In October, the Admiralty made a decision that would change naval warfare permanently. Every major warship in the Royal Navy would receive at least one Jensen gyroscopic anti-aircraft sight. Priority would go to capital ships, carriers, cruisers, then destroyers. Smaller vessels would have to wait. The decision was logical from a strategic perspective. Larger ships were more valuable, carried more armament, and were harder to replace. Protecting them first made sense, but it also meant that the smallest vessels, the corvettes and minesweepers and patrol boats, would continue fighting with obsolete equipment. Jensen was promoted to Chief Petty Officer and transferred to HMS Illustrious, one of Britain's newest aircraft carriers. The carrier mounted multiple 4.5-inch guns, and all of them would receive gyro sights. Jensen's job was to train the gun crews and coordinate defensive fire during air attacks. The carrier was scheduled to participate in Operation Judgment, a planned strike against the Italian fleet at Taranto. If successful, it would cripple Italy's naval power in the Mediterranean. If unsuccessful, Illustrious would become a primary target for every Italian aircraft within range. The raid on Taranto occurred on the night of November 11th, 1940. Illustrious launched 21 Swordfish torpedo bombers in 2 waves. The ancient-looking biplanes, so slow they seemed to hang in the air, attacked the Italian battle fleet in its own harbour. They sank or damaged 3 battleships, 2 cruisers, and 2 destroyers for the loss of only 2 aircraft. It was the most successful carrier strike in naval history to that point, and it fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Mediterranean. But the Italian Regia Aeronautica wanted revenge. On January 10, 1941, 43 Stuka dive bombers attacked HMS Illustrious off the coast of Malta. The carrier's gun crews, equipped with Jensen's sights, opened fire at maximum range. The engagement lasted 17 minutes. In that time, Illustrious's guns fired over 3,000 rounds and brought down 11 attacking aircraft. But 11 wasn't enough. 32 Stukas got through the defensive fire. The carrier took 6 direct bomb hits and multiple near misses. 1 bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, starting fires that killed dozens of sailors and destroyed several aircraft. Another bomb struck the aft gun position, killing the entire crew, including the gunner manning the Jensen sight. Illustrious survived, barely. The ship limped into Malta's Grand Harbour, trailing smoke and listing heavily. Damage control teams worked for 3 days to save her. Eventually, she was patched up enough to make the journey to Alexandria for proper repairs. Jensen had been stationed in the forward gun position during the attack. He'd personally shot down 3 Stukas. He'd watched his sight-equipped guns across the ship bring down 8 more. And he'd watched 32 aircraft get through anyway. The mathematics were unforgiving. Even with the best technology, even with trained crews and working equipment, the attackers could still win through sheer numbers. The war wasn't going to be won by a single innovation, no matter how effective. It would be won by the accumulated advantages of hundreds of innovations, thousands of tactical improvements, millions of individual acts of courage and competence. In February 1941, Jensen was summoned to London. The Admiralty wanted him to testify before a joint committee examining anti-aircraft warfare effectiveness. He travelled by train through a Britain transformed by war. Cities showed bomb damage. Factories ran around the clock. Civilians wore uniforms. The entire nation had mobilised for a conflict that showed no signs of ending. The committee hearing took place in a basement room beneath the Admiralty building, chosen for its protection from air raids. Jensen sat before a panel of senior officers, civilian scientists, and government officials. They asked him technical questions about the site's operation, about training requirements, about combat effectiveness. He answered honestly, providing data, describing engagements, acknowledging both successes and limitations. Then, one of the civilian officials, a man Jensen didn't recognize, asked a different kind of question. Mr. Jensen, you were 19 years old when you built this device. You had no formal engineering degree, no military weapons training, no official support. What made you think you could solve a problem that professional weapons designers had failed to address? Jensen considered the question carefully before answering. I didn't think I could solve it, sir. I thought I had to try. The standard sights weren't working. Men were dying because we couldn't hit attacking aircraft. Either someone found a better way, or we'd lose the war. I was in a position to try, so I tried. The official nodded slowly. And when your commanding officers ordered you to dismantle the site? I disobeyed, sir. Jensen's voice remained steady. I knew it was wrong to disobey orders, but I also knew that following those orders would get people killed. So I made a choice. I accepted that there would be consequences, but I couldn't accept watching my shipmates die when I had something that might save them. The room was silent for a moment. Then Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, the first Sea Lord who had approved Jensen's original transfer request, spoke for the first time. Mr. Jensen, Your device has accounted for approximately 240 confirmed aircraft kills across the fleet since June. Your training programs have improved fleet-wide gunnery effectiveness by an estimated factor of 3. You've contributed more to Britain's air defence than most people will contribute to anything in their entire lives. And you did it by being willing to disobey orders when those orders were stupid. The official recommendation of this committee is that you receive a commission as a lieutenant in the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve and assignment to the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, where your talents can be properly utilised. Jensen was 20 years old. He'd been in the Navy for 16 months, and he was being offered an officer's commission and a position designing weapons for the entire British military. He accepted. The work at the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development consumed the next 2 years of his life. He collaborated with scientists and engineers on projects ranging from improved radar systems to proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells. The gyro sight that bore his name continued to evolve, incorporating better optics, more precise gyroscopes, and eventually, primitive analog computers that could calculate deflection for multiple targets simultaneously. By 1943, the Jensen sight and its derivatives equipped virtually every major warship in the Royal Navy and had been adopted by the United States Navy under a technology-sharing agreement. American engineers refined the design further, creating the Mark 51 Director, a sophisticated fire control system that combined gyroscopic sights with radar tracking and centralized gun control. The effectiveness, improvements were measured in lives saved and ships protected. Statistical analysis conducted after the war showed that vessels equipped with gyroscopic gun sights suffered casualty rates approximately 50% lower than vessels with standard sights when facing air attack. That 50% represented thousands of sailors who went home instead of dying at sea. But Jensen never forgot the cost of even successful defense. For every aircraft shot down, others got through. For every ship saved, others sank. War wasn't a problem that could be solved with engineering. It could only be endured, survived, and eventually ended through the accumulated weight of industrial production, tactical competence, and human sacrifice. The irony of Jensen's story wasn't lost on him. He'd been threatened with court-martial for creating a device that saved British lives. The Admiralty, the institution responsible for defending Britain at sea, had initially rejected his innovation because it didn't follow proper procedures. If he'd been a more obedient sailor, if he'd followed orders and dismantled his sight as commanded, hundreds or thousands of men would have died who instead survived. The lesson was uncomfortable for military institutions that depended on discipline and hierarchy. Sometimes, disobedience was the right choice. Sometimes, the 19-year-old apprentice understood the problem better than the admirals. Sometimes, survival required ignoring the chain of command and doing what worked instead of what was authorized. Jensen remained with the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development until the war ended in 1945. He worked on dozens of projects, some successful, many failures. He learned that innovation was mostly failure, that for every breakthrough there were 10 dead ends, that progress came from being willing to try ideas that probably wouldn't work in the hope that occasionally one would. After the war, he returned to civilian life and the espinso, engineering career that had been interrupted by military service. He worked for various optics and instruments firms, contributing to developments in camera technology, surveying equipment, and eventually, early computer systems. He never spoke publicly about his wartime service. He gave no interviews, wrote no memoirs, sought no recognition. The Jensen gyroscopic anti-aircraft sight remained in Royal Navy service until the 1960s, when it was finally replaced by fully automated radar-directed gun systems. By then, the men who had used it in combat were mostly retired or dead, and the weapon had become a historical curiosity studied by military historians and weapons collectors. Jensen died in 1998 at the age of 77. His obituary in the Times of London mentioned his wartime service in a single sentence. The full story of what he'd accomplished, of the lives he'd saved, of the innovation he'd created in defiance of orders, remained largely unknown, outside specialist military circles. The broader lesson of his story transcends the specific technology of gun sights and anti-aircraft warfare. It speaks to the nature of innovation in crisis, to the tension between institutional authority and individual initiative, to the moral complexity of disobedience in service of a greater good. Jensen's sight worked because it addressed a real problem that existing systems failed to solve. It succeeded because one young sailor was willing to risk his career to prove that his solution was better than the approved alternative. And it saved lives because institutions, despite their initial resistance, eventually recognized merit when it was demonstrated under fire. The Second World War produced countless stories of individual innovation, of soldiers and sailors and airmen who found better ways to fight, to survive, to protect their comrades. Most of these innovations were small, incremental improvements that never made headlines. A better way to maintain an engine, a more effective camouflage pattern, a tactical adjustment that reduced casualties by a few %. But collectively, these small improvements accumulated into enormous advantages. The side that learned faster, adapted quicker, and implemented innovations more effectively gained edges that, multiplied across millions of soldiers and thousands of engagements, determined the war's outcome. Jensen's story also illustrates the human cost of technological warfare. Even with the best defensive systems, attacks still succeeded. Even with trained crews and working equipment, ships still sank and sailors still died. Technology could improve survival odds, but it couldn't eliminate risk. The mathematics of combat were always brutal, always unforgiving. The war ended not because defensive technology became perfect, but because offensive capacity was eventually exhausted. Germany and Japan ran out of aircraft, out of pilots, out of fuel, out of industrial capacity to replace. Losses. The Allied advantage wasn't primarily technological, it was industrial and demographic. They could build more ships, train more sailors, and sustain losses longer than their enemies. Jensen's sight helped preserve that advantage by keeping ships and crews in service longer, by reducing the rate at which Britain's limited naval resources were destroyed. In that sense, it was a strategic weapon as much as a tactical one. Today, the principles Jensen discovered are embedded in every military targeting system. Modern gun directors use computers and sensors far more sophisticated than his mechanical gyroscope, but they solve the same fundamental problem: how to hit a moving target from a moving platform. The mathematics haven't changed. Physics still dictates that projectiles inherit the velocity of the platform that fires them, that deflection must account for relative motion, that successful gunnery requires predicting where the target will be rather than where it is. What has changed is the speed of calculation. Jensen's sight required the gunner to track the target manually, while the gyroscope calculated deflection. Modern systems track automatically, calculate instantly, and fire without human intervention. The human element has been progressively removed, replaced by sensors and computers that react faster and more accurately than any sailor could. But the fundamental insight remains Jensen's legacy: that survival in technological warfare requires understanding the physics of your weapons better than your enemy understands theirs, and that sometimes that understanding comes from unexpected sources. The teenager who built a gun sight from scavenged parts wasn't supposed to revolutionize naval warfare. He was supposed to follow orders, use standard equipment, and accept whatever survival odds that equipment provided. His refusal to accept those odds, his willingness to try something different despite official disapproval, saved hundreds of lives and influenced military technology for generations. That refusal, that willingness to challenge authority when authority was wrong, represents both the best and most dangerous aspect of human nature in warfare. Organizations need discipline and hierarchy to function, but they also need individuals willing to question, to innovate, to disobey when obedience means death. Finding the balance between those competing needs remains one of the central challenges of military leadership. Jensen found that balance by being willing to accept the consequences of disobedience while insisting on the rightness of his choice. He didn't argue that orders should be routinely ignored, but he demonstrated that some circumstances justify defiance, that survival sometimes requires breaking rules, and that institutions, if they're wise, learn to recognize and reward that kind of constructive disobedience. The lesson applies far beyond military contexts. Innovation always challenges established procedures. New ideas always threaten existing hierarchies. Progress always requires someone to say that the old way isn't good enough and to risk their position, proving that a better way exists. Jensen's story is ultimately a story about courage, not the courage to face enemy fire, though he demonstrated that as well, but the courage to stand alone against institutional resistance and insist that there must be a better way. That kind of courage changed the course of the Second World War in small but significant ways, and in a conflict decided by the accumulated weight of thousands of small advantages, those changes mattered. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.